The dust-laden wind carried the distant sound of hammering as Violet Nelson clutched her infant daughter closer to her chest, tears streaming down her dirt-streaked face. She'd walked for miles after being thrown from the stagecoach, her cotton dress torn and mudded, with nothing but a small bundle of belongings and her 3-month-old baby, Emma. The bustling frontier town of Sweetwater, Wyoming Territory, loomed before her like a mirage in the scorching summer of 1875, her last hope in a world that had taken everything else. "Just a little farther, my sweet girl," Violet whispered, her parched lips cracking as she spoke. "We'll find help. We have to." The journey from Philadelphia had depleted the last of her resources: money, strength, and hope. Her husband Thomas had died of typhoid fever just weeks after Emma's birth, leaving Violet with mounting debts and no family to turn to. The promise of a position as a schoolteacher out west had seemed like divine providence. But the letter of employment had proven false, nothing more than a cruel scheme that left her stranded at her remote way station, where the stagecoach driver had thrown her off when he discovered she couldn't pay the remaining fare. As Violet staggered into Sweetwater, Emma began to fuss, her tiny face red with hunger. It had been hours since Violet had been able to feed her properly. Her own stomach had been empty for longer. "Please, little one." "Just a little while longer," she soothed, though her voice cracked with desperation. Main Street bustled with activity: cowboys, merchants, and townspeople moving with purpose. No one paid mind to the bedraggled woman and her infant. Violet approached a water trough outside the general store and, checking to ensure no one was watching, dampened a cloth to cool her daughter's feverish skin. "You can't be doing that, miss." A stern voice startled her. Violet turned to face a rotund man in an expensive suit, his watch chain gleaming in the sunlight. "Forgive me, sir. My baby, she's terribly hot." "That water's for horses, not vagrants," he replied, eyeing her with distaste. "Where's your husband?" "I'm a widow, sir." Violet struggled to stand straight. "I've come for the teaching position." The man let out a harsh laugh. "Teaching position? That was filled 3 months ago. Besides, we don't hire women with infants to tend to." "But the letter," Violet began, but the man cut her off with a dismissive wave. "Not my concern. Now move along before I call the sheriff." Violet stumbled away, desperation mounting. She tried the hotel, offering to work as a maid, only to be turned away. The restaurant wouldn't even let her through the door in her condition. By sunset, she had been rejected at every establishment in town. Night was falling when she collapsed on the steps of the church, Emma wailing with hunger. The door creaked open and an elderly woman peered out. "Oh my," the woman said, her face softening at the sight of the mother and child. "Come in, dear. Come in." Inside, the woman introduced herself as Martha, the church caretaker's wife. She provided Violet with a bowl of thin stew and a place to sit while Emma nursed. "I don't know what to do," Violet confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've nowhere to go, no money." Martha's weathered face grew troubled. "The church can provide shelter for tonight, but Reverend Hollister returns tomorrow. He's not as charitable toward unwed mothers." "But I'm a widow," Violet protested weakly. Martha shook her head. "Without papers or a man to vouch for you, that's a claim many make." "What am I to do then?" Violet asked, terror rising in her chest. Martha hesitated. "There's Jeb Rollins. He runs the saloon and other businesses. He sometimes takes on women in your situation." Violet's heart sank. She knew what other businesses meant. "I can't. I won't." "There's the auction," Martha suggested quietly. "Tomorrow morning. Sometimes ranchers looking for housekeepers or cooks will take on a woman in need. It's not ideal, but it's legal and respectable enough." Desperate and with no alternatives, Violet agreed to meet Martha at the auction block the next morning. Dawn broke crisp and cool as Violet, having spent a restless night in the church basement, made her way to the town square with Martha. Emma slept against her chest, wrapped in the cleanest cloth Violet could find. The auction was primarily for livestock and property, but Martha guided Violet to a corner where several people, mostly men, stood waiting. Some were clearly laborers seeking work. Others appeared to be indentured servants whose contracts were being resold. "Now, you'll need to stand there," Martha explained, pointing to a small raised platform. "When they call for work contracts, you step up. State your skills plainly." "This feels wrong," Violet whispered, clutching Emma tighter. "It's how things are done out here sometimes," Martha replied. "Better than the alternatives." The auctioneer, a tall man with a booming voice, worked through the cattle and horses efficiently. Finally, he turned to the people waiting. "Any laborers or household help contracts to be established or transferred?" Violet's legs trembled as she mounted the platform. The crowd was smaller now, mostly men in ranching clothes, a few women in sensible dresses, likely ranchers' wives looking for household help. "Name and skills?" the auctioneer asked brusquely. "Violet Nelson," she managed to say. "I'm educated. I can read, write, and cipher. I'm skilled in household management, cooking, and sewing. I was to be a school teacher." The baby shifted in her arms, and whispers rippled through the small crowd. "She's got a baby," someone muttered. "Can't work properly with an infant," another voice added. The auctioneer frowned. "Any offers for domestic help, woman with infant?" The silence was deafening. $5, came a gruff voice from the back. Violet peered through the crowd to see a man in his 50s, with a cruel twist to his mouth. She recognized him as the owner of the saloon Martha had mentioned. $5 for the woman's contract, the auctioneer repeated. "Do I hear 10? Silence fell again. 5 going once. Violet's heart hammered in her chest. The saloon owner's eyes raked over her in a way that made her skin crawl. 5 going twice. $50. The new voice cut through the murmurs like a knife. The crowd parted to reveal a tall man in a worn leather vest and dusty hat. His face was partially shadowed, but Violet could make out a strong jaw dusted with stubble and eyes as blue as a summer sky. The auctioneer's eyebrows shot up. $50 from Mr. Callahan. "That's too much for a woman with a baby," protested the saloon owner. The newcomer stepped forward, his spurs jingling softly. "They belong to me." A collective gasp rippled through the onlookers. "Your name, sir, for the contract?" the auctioneer asked. "Ethan Callahan," the man replied, his gaze never leaving Violet's face. "Ranch owner north of town." The saloon owner scoffed but backed away, knowing he was outbid. Moments later, Violet found herself standing before Ethan Callahan, a signed contract in his hands that gave him the right to her labor for 1 year in exchange for room, board, and the $50 which had been paid to the town council to cover her public expenses as a destitute person. Up close, Ethan Callahan was younger than she'd first thought, perhaps 30 or 31. His face was weathered from the sun, but his eyes held a kindness that gave her a small measure of comfort. "My wagon's this way, Mrs. Nelson," he said, gesturing toward a sturdy buckboard hitched to 2 strong horses. "Why?" Violet asked, unable to stop herself. "Why would you pay so much?" Ethan's expression was unreadable as he helped her into the wagon, careful of the baby in her arms. "No decent woman and child should be sold for a paltry sum to the likes of Rollins," he said simply, climbing up beside her. "Besides, I need help at the ranch." As the wagon pulled away from Sweetwater, Violet cradled Emma and stared at the dusty road ahead. She had escaped one fate, only to face an uncertain future with a stranger who now legally owned her labor for a year. Whether this Ethan Callahan would prove her salvation or another nightmare remained to be seen. The journey to Ethan Callahan's ranch took nearly 3 hours, winding through scrubby plains that eventually gave way to greener pastures nestled in the shadow of distant mountains. Throughout the ride, Ethan remained mostly silent, occasionally pointing out landmarks or warning Violet of a rough patch in the road ahead. Emma had awakened and begun to fuss, hungry and uncomfortable in the jostling wagon. "We're nearly there," Ethan said, his voice softening as he glanced at the infant. "There's a creek up ahead. We can stop so you can tend to her if you need to." Grateful, Violet nodded. When they reached the creek, Ethan helped her down from the wagon with a gentleness that surprised her, then turned his back to give her privacy as she nursed Emma and refreshed herself with the cool water. "I don't know what you've heard about me in town," Ethan said suddenly, his back still turned. "But I want you to know you'll be safe at my ranch. Your contract, it's just formality. I needed a housekeeper and you needed help. That's all." Violet adjusted her dress as Emma finished nursing. "I know nothing about you, Mr. Callahan. I only arrived in Sweetwater yesterday." He turned, and for the first time she noticed a small scar that cut through his right eyebrow. "Then we're starting fresh. That's good." Back in the wagon, Violet found herself studying Ethan more carefully. His hands were calloused and strong as he handled the reins, but there was a careful precision to his movements. Though his clothes were worn, they were clean and well mended. Most notably, he treated his horses with gentle respect, never using the whip that lay coiled at his feet. "There it is," Ethan said eventually, nodding toward a cluster of buildings in the distance. "Callahan Ranch." As they drew closer, Violet saw a modest but well-maintained homestead. The main house was built of sturdy logs with a stone foundation and a proper shingled roof. A large barn stood nearby, along with several smaller outbuildings. A corral held about a dozen horses, and in the distance, cattle grazed on the rolling pastures. "It's not much compared to some," Ethan said, a note of pride in his voice, "but it's mine free and clear. 2,500 acres, 200 head of cattle, and the finest quarter horses this side of the Rockies." A young man emerged from the barn as they approached, waving in greeting. "That's Daniel, my ranch hand," Ethan explained. "He's a good worker. There's also Mrs. Winters, who comes 3 days a week from town to help with cooking and laundry, but she's getting on in years. That's why I've been looking for a permanent housekeeper." Daniel jogged over as Ethan brought the wagon to a halt in front of the house. He was younger than Ethan, perhaps 22, with sandy hair and freckles scattered across his nose. "Welcome back, boss," he called, then paused when he saw Violet and Emma. His eyebrows rose questioningly. "Daniel, this is Mrs. Violet Nelson and her daughter Emma," Ethan said, jumping down from the wagon. "Mrs. Nelson will be taking over as our housekeeper." Daniel touched the brim of his hat politely. "Madam, please help Mrs. Nelson with her belongings while I show her the house," Ethan instructed, then frowned when he realized Violet had nothing but the small bundle she clutched along with Emma. Violet felt heat rise to her cheeks at his realization, but Ethan smoothly continued as if he hadn't noticed. "Actually, Daniel, see to the horses. Mrs. Nelson and I will manage." Inside, the house was surprisingly comfortable. A large main room served as both kitchen and living area, with a massive stone fireplace dominating one wall. A sturdy table with 6 chairs sat in the kitchen space, while a pair of well-worn leather armchairs faced the hearth. Bookshelves lined one wall, unexpectedly filled with volumes. "You read?" Violet couldn't help asking, surprised to see so many books in a rancher's home. A faint smile touched Ethan's lips. "Every night. My mother was a school teacher before she married my father, She insisted education didn't end when schooling did. He led her down a short hallway. "My room is there," he said, nodding toward a closed door, "and this will be yours." The bedroom he showed her was small but clean, with a narrow bed, a chest of drawers, and a small table with a wash basin. A window overlooked a kitchen garden in the back of the house. "There's a cradle in the storage room," Ethan added. "My sister left it when she moved to California with her husband. I'll have Daniel bring it in for the baby." "Thank you," Violet said, overwhelmed by his consideration. "Mr. Callahan, I don't understand why. You can call me Ethan," he interrupted gently. "And as for why, let's just say I know what it's like to be at the mercy of strangers." His gaze dropped to Emma, who was now sleeping peacefully in Violet's arms. No child should suffer for circumstances beyond their control. Before Violet could respond, a sharp knock at the front door drew Ethan's attention. "That'll be Mrs. Winters," he said. "She comes on Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays. You can rest today and get settled. Tomorrow she can show you the routines." As evening approached, Violet sat at the kitchen table with Emma asleep in the cradle beside her, watching as Mrs. Winters, a robust woman in her 60s with iron-gray hair and capable hands, prepared a hearty supper of beef stew, cornbread, and apple pie. "So you're from Philadelphia?" Mrs. Winters asked, her tone curious but not unkind. "Long way to travel alone with an infant." "Yes," Violet replied carefully. "My husband died shortly after Emma was born. I had a position as a teacher waiting, but it fell through." Mrs. Winters nodded sagely. "Happens more often than folks like to admit. The West isn't always what it's promised to be." She glanced toward the window where Ethan could be seen chopping wood in the yard. "You're fortunate, though. Mr. Callahan is a good man. Keeps to himself mostly, but fair and honest." "He mentioned his mother was a teacher," Violet said, hoping to learn more about her new employer. "Yes, and his father was a rancher down near Laramie. Both gone now, God rest their souls. Influenza took them 5 years back, just a few months apart. Ethan was just 26 when he inherited the ranch." Mrs. Winters lowered her voice. "There was a young lady he was courting then, from one of the prominent families in Cheyenne. Once his parents died and he was left with all the responsibility of the ranch, she broke things off. Said she didn't want the life of a rancher's wife." Violet felt a pang of sympathy for Ethan. "That must have been difficult." "He's managed," Mrs. Winters said with a shrug. "Keeps busy with the ranch and those books of his." She wiped her hands on her apron and smiled. "Now, let me show you where everything is in the kitchen before the men come in for supper." That night, after a simple but satisfying meal during which Ethan and Daniel discussed ranch business while Violet mostly listened, Violet lay in the unfamiliar bed with Emma sleeping beside her in the cradle. The sheets were clean, the blanket warm, and for the first time in weeks, she felt a tentative sense of security. Yet as she drifted toward sleep, questions nagged at her mind. Why had Ethan Callahan really paid $50 for a woman and child he didn't know? What had he meant when he said they belonged to him? And most importantly, could she trust that his intentions were truly as honorable as they seemed? The first week at Callahan Ranch passed in a blur of learning routines and settling into her new role. Mrs. Winters proved an excellent teacher, showing Violet the particulars of managing a ranch household, from preserving the vegetables from the kitchen garden to properly cleaning Ethan's surprisingly extensive collection of books. "He gets them from a bookseller in Cheyenne," Mrs. Winters explained as Violet carefully dusted a shelf of leather-bound volumes. "Orders them special. Shakespeare, Dickens, even that new fellow Twain. Says reading keeps his mind sharp during the long winter months." Violet found herself impressed by the breadth of Ethan's collection. It spoke of a man far more educated and thoughtful than the average rancher. Emma thrived in the clean air and regular routine. Violet had converted a corner of her bedroom into a nursery space, and Ethan had instructed Daniel to build a small fence for a play area in the yard where Violet could keep Emma while hanging laundry or tending to the chickens. On her 8th day at the ranch, Violet was kneading bread dough when she heard the pounding of hooves approaching. Through the window, she saw Ethan and Daniel returning from the north pasture, where they'd been mending fences. Ethan dismounted with fluid grace, his tall frame moving with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to physical labor. As he strode toward the house, Violet noticed he carried something under his arm, a package wrapped in brown paper. He smiled when he entered, the expression transforming his usually serious face. "Afternoon, Mrs. Nelson," he greeted, removing his hat and hanging it on a peg by the door. "Something smells good." "Fresh bread for dinner," Violet replied, returning his smile. "And please call me Violet, Mrs. Nelson makes me feel like I should be looking for my mother-in-law." A chuckle escaped him the first time she'd heard him laugh. "Violet, then." He hesitated, then held out the package. "This came in from town. It's for you." Surprised, Violet wiped her hands on her apron and accepted the parcel. "For me? But I wasn't expecting anything." "Open it," Ethan encouraged, an unexpected eagerness in his eyes. Unwrapping the paper, Violet gasped. Inside lay 3 dresses, one practical brown calico for everyday wear, one blue cotton slightly more refined, and one emerald green with delicate lace at the collar and cuffs that could pass for Sunday best. Beneath the dresses were undergarments, stockings, and a pair of sturdy leather boots. "Mr. Callahan, Ethan, I don't understand. I noticed you had few belongings," he said, suddenly looking uncomfortable. "A woman needs proper clothes, especially with winter coming. There's also some things for Emma in the bottom." Sure enough, beneath everything else lay several tiny gowns and blankets sized for a growing infant. Tears pricked at Violet's eyes. "This is too generous. I can't accept. Consider it an advance against your wages," Ethan said quickly. "Or part of our arrangement. Either way, they're yours." Violet touched the fabric of the green dress, feeling the quality. "Thank you," she whispered. "You've been kinder than I could have expected." Something flickered in Ethan's eyes, an emotion Violet couldn't quite name. "It's nothing," he said gruffly, turning away. "Just practical. Can't have my housekeeper catching pneumonia when the snow flies." That Sunday, Violet wore the green dress to accompany Ethan to the small church in Sweetwater. It was her first return to town since the auction, and she felt a mixture of anxiety and defiance as she sat beside Ethan in the wagon. Emma dressed in one of her new gowns. "You don't have to do this," Ethan said quietly as they approached the town. "No one would think less of you for staying at the ranch." Violet straightened her shoulders. "I won't hide away as if I've done something shameful. I haven't." A smile touched Ethan's lips. "No, you haven't." The church service passed without incident, though Violet was aware of curious glances and whispered comments. She held her head high, focusing on the reverend's sermon rather than the gossip. Ethan remained a steady presence beside her, occasionally bouncing Emma on his knee when she grew restless. After the service, several women approached, drawn by the baby and curiosity about the newcomer at Callahan Ranch. "Mrs. Nelson, isn't it?" A plump woman with kind eyes introduced herself as Mrs. Henderson, the doctor's wife. "We're so glad to see you found a position, and what a beautiful baby." Before Violet could respond, another woman sharply dressed with an air of importance cut in. "So you're the woman Ethan bought at auction," she said, her voice carrying just enough to draw attention. "How interesting." Ethan stepped forward, his expression cooling. "Mrs. Montgomery." Always a pleasure. The woman smiled thinly. Ethan, dear, I was just getting acquainted with your housekeeper. Mrs. Nelson is indeed managing my household, Ethan replied evenly. We're fortunate to have found someone so capable, Mrs. Montgomery's gaze slid from Ethan to Violet and back again, a calculating look in her eyes. Indeed. Well, do bring her to the harvest social next month. We're always eager to welcome new faces to our little community. With that, she glided away, leaving an uncomfortable silence in her wake. Mrs. Henderson sighed. Don't mind Harriet Montgomery. Her husband owns the bank, and she thinks that makes her the queen of Sweetwater. On the ride back to the ranch, Violet finally gathered the courage to ask the question that had been bothering her since the encounter. Ethan, that woman Mrs. Montgomery, she seemed to know you well. Ethan's hands tightened on the reins. Victoria Montgomery is my former fiancé's cousin. She's never forgiven me for disappointing her family when Caroline broke our engagement. Mrs. Winters mentioned you were once engaged, Violet said carefully. I'm sorry it didn't work out. Ethan was quiet for so long that Violet thought he might not respond. Finally, he said, it was for the best. Caroline wanted a husband who would move to Cheyenne and join her father's banking business. I couldn't leave the ranch, not after my parents worked so hard to build it. He glanced at Violet. Some people aren't meant for the life out here. It takes a certain kind of strength. Violet thought about her journey west, the hardships she'd already endured, and the uncertain future that still lay ahead. I think perhaps I'm stronger than I knew, she said softly. Ethan's eyes met hers, warm and appraising. I think you might be right about that, Violet Nelson. As autumn deepened, the days grew shorter and the air crisper. Violet settled into a comfortable routine at the ranch, finding satisfaction in the orderly running of the household. Emma was thriving, growing plumper and more alert with each passing day. More surprising was Violet's growing ease with Ethan. Their initial wariness had given way to a comfortable companionship. In the evenings, after supper was cleared away and Emma was sleeping, they often sat before the fire while Ethan read aloud from one of his books. Dickens was a favorite, or they simply talked, sharing stories of their lives before their paths had crossed. Violet learned that Ethan had attended 2 years of college in Denver before his father's health required his return to the ranch. He spoke of his parents with deep affection and of his sister Rebecca, now married to a lawyer in San Francisco with 2 children of her own. In turn, Violet shared stories of her childhood in Philadelphia, her years as a student and then a teacher's assistant, and her brief but happy marriage to Thomas. He was a kind man, she said one evening as they sat by the fire, a storm raging outside. Not a great passion, perhaps, but we were fond of each other. His death came as a shock. He seemed so strong, and then the fever took him in just days. Ethan's face was thoughtful in the firelight. I'm sorry you had to face that alone. His family never approved of me, Violet admitted. I was a schoolteacher with no dowry or connections. When he died, they made it clear I wasn't welcome. The debts were considerable. Thomas had invested poorly in a friend's business venture just before he fell ill. So you came west, Violet nodded. The advertisement seemed heaven-sent. A school in Wyoming Territory seeking a teacher, offering room and board plus a modest salary. I spent nearly everything I had on the journey, only to discover upon arrival that no such position existed. Ethan's expression darkened. A cruel trick. Too common out here, false advertisements luring women west for other purposes. I realized that too late, Violet said. By then I was stranded. Ethan leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. Violet, there's something I need to tell you about why I was at that auction. Violet's heart quickened. Yes, I knew about you before that day, he confessed. Martha, the church caretaker's wife, she's my mother's cousin. When you arrived in Sweetwater, she sent Daniel a message asking if I needed household help. She mentioned you had a baby and were in desperate circumstances. So you came to town specifically to help me? Violet asked, astonished. Ethan nodded, looking almost embarrassed. I was planning to offer you a position properly, but when I arrived and found you on that auction block. His jaw tightened. I knew what Rollins intended. I couldn't let that happen. You said we belonged to you, Violet recalled quietly. A poor choice of words, Ethan admitted. I meant only to establish a claim that would prevent any misunderstanding about my intentions. I should have explained sooner. Violet studied him in the flickering light, this man who had rescued her without expectation of gratitude or reward. Thank you, she said simply. Not many would have done what you did. Any decent man would have, Ethan replied, but the intensity in his blue eyes suggested there was more to his actions than mere decency. The conversation marked a turning point in their relationship. The last barriers of formality fell away, and Violet found herself looking forward to their evenings together with increasing anticipation. She began to notice things about Ethan she hadn't before. The way sunlight caught the auburn highlights in his brown hair, the gentle strength of his hands as he held Emma, the rare but transformative nature of his full smile. One crisp October morning, Violet was hanging laundry while Emma napped in her cradle on the porch when the sound of approaching riders drew her attention. 3 men on horseback were coming up the road to the ranch, strangers, not the neighboring ranchers she had come to recognize. Instinctively, Violet moved to the porch, standing protectively near Emma as the men approached. Ethan and Daniel were in the north pasture, too far to call easily. The riders reined in before the house. The leader, a hard-faced man with a scar across his chin, tipped his hat with mocking politeness. "Morning, madam. This the Callahan spread?" "It is," Violet replied cautiously. "Mr. Callahan is working with the cattle. If you have business with him, you can wait, or I can direct you to where he's working." The man exchanged glances with his companions. "No need to trouble yourself. We'll just wait here till he returns." His gaze drifted to Emma, then back to Violet, taking in her figure with an insolence that made her skin crawl. "You must be the woman Callahan bought at auction." Word spread about that, caused quite a stir in some quarters. Violet lifted her chin. "I'm the housekeeper, yes." The man chuckled, a sound without warmth. "Housekeeper? Is that what they're calling it these days?" Before Violet could respond, another voice cut through the tension. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" Ethan's voice was controlled but hard as he rode up from the direction of the barn, his rifle resting casually across his saddle. Violet hadn't heard him approach and felt a rush of relief at his presence. The leader of the strangers straightened in his saddle. "Callahan. Been a while." "Not long enough, Tucker," Ethan replied. "What brings you to my property?" "Mr. Montgomery sends his regards," the man called Tucker said. "Wanted us to remind you that the note on your water rights comes due next month." "The bank already sent written notice," Ethan said evenly. "I'll make the payment on time as always. No need for a personal reminder." Tucker smiled unpleasantly. "Mr. Montgomery thought, given your recent expenses," his eyes flicked toward Violet, "you might be finding yourself short on cash. He's prepared to offer an extension with additional interest, of course, or perhaps discuss an outright purchase of those rights." Ethan's expression remained impassive, but Violet saw the tension in his shoulders. "My finances are my concern. The payment will be made as agreed. Now, if that's all, my ranch hand and I have work to return to." Tucker shrugged elaborately. "Just being neighborly." His gaze lingered on Violet once more. Pretty housekeeper you've got yourself. Be a shame if anything interfered with your arrangement." The thinly veiled threat hung in the air. "Good day, Tucker," Ethan said, his voice like steel. "Don't make me ask you to leave twice." With a mock salute, Tucker wheeled his horse around. "We'll be seeing you, Callahan." The three men rode off, kicking up dust as they went. Once they were out of sight, Ethan dismounted and strode to where Violet stood on the porch, his face tight with concern. "Are you all right? Did they say anything to you before I arrived?" "Nothing specific," Violet said, still shaken. "Who were they?" Ethan's jaw clenched. "Hugh Tucker and his boys. They work for James Montgomery, the banker, and Harriet Montgomery's husband. They're his collectors when people fall behind on loans." He glanced toward where the men had disappeared. "Montgomery's been trying to buy my water rights for 2 years. The creek that runs through my property feeds his land to the south, but he wants full control of it." "Is the note they mentioned a serious concern?" Violet asked, worried. Ethan's expression softened slightly. "No, the ranch is doing well this year. I have the money set aside." He hesitated. "Violet, I'm sorry you had to face them. There are implications about our arrangement." "People will talk," Violet said with more calmness than she felt. "I learned that lesson in Philadelphia. What matters is that we know the truth." Ethan studied her face for a long moment. "You're a remarkable woman, Violet Nelson." That evening, as Violet prepared supper, her mind kept returning to the encounter with Tucker and his men. Not just their threatening manner, but the way they had insinuated that her presence at the ranch was something improper. It hadn't been the first such implication. There had been whispers at church, and Mrs. Montgomery's pointed comments, but it was the most direct challenge to her position. As she and Ethan ate, she finally voiced her concern. "Ethan, I need to ask you something directly." She set down her fork. "Is my presence here causing you difficulties in town? With your standing or your business?" Ethan looked up, surprise evident in his expression. "Why would you think that? The visitors today, the comments at church. People seem to believe there's something improper about our arrangement." Ethan sighed, pushing his plate away. "Small towns run on gossip, Violet. Yes, there are whispers. Some people can't imagine a man and woman living under the same roof without impropriety, but I don't give a damn what they think. But your business dealings if it affects your relationship with the bank. Montgomery's interest in my water rights has nothing to do with you," Ethan assured her. "That battle was ongoing long before you arrived. As for the rest..." He hesitated. "I won't deny that some, like Harriet Montgomery, enjoy implying scandal. But my true friends know better, and my business associates care more about whether my cattle are healthy and my debts paid than who manages my household." Violet nodded slowly, somewhat reassured. "Still, perhaps we should be more careful. I could stay at the ranch when you go to town, at least for a while." "Absolutely not," Ethan said firmly. "I won't have you hiding away as if you've done something wrong. Besides," he added with a small smile, "Emma would miss the Sunday school ladies fussing over her." The mention of Emma brought another worry to mind. "Ethan, our contract, it's for 1 year. I've been thinking about what happens after that. Emma will be walking by then, growing more every day. I need to plan for our future." Something flickered in Ethan's eyes, an emotion Violet couldn't quite identify. "You've become invaluable here, Violet. When the year is up, I'd be happy to renew our arrangement, with increased wages, of course." "That's very kind," Violet said carefully. "But eventually, I need to establish independence. For Emma's sake. She deserves a mother who can provide for her on her own terms." "I understand," Ethan said after a pause. "Perhaps we could discuss you taking on additional responsibilities. The ranch accounts need organizing, and with your education, you'd be well suited to the task. It would justify higher wages, allowing you to save for your future. Gratitude washed over Violet. You've thought about this. I've thought about many things since you arrived, Violet, Ethan replied quietly. I want you to know that whatever you decide when our contract ends, you have my support. As November arrived, bringing the first dusting of snow to the rolling hills around the ranch, Ethan began including Violet in more aspects of the ranch business. He taught her his bookkeeping system, showed her how to calculate the costs of feeding the livestock through winter, and explained his contracts with the cattle buyers from Cheyenne. Violet proved a quick study, finding satisfaction in organizing the jumbled records into a coherent system. Each evening, they would sit at the kitchen table after Emma was asleep, working side by lamplight. You have a natural head for figures, Ethan commented one evening as Violet reconciled a discrepancy in the feed costs. Better than mine, certainly. Violet smiled, pleased by the compliment. Numbers always made sense to me. They're straightforward, unlike people. Unlike people indeed, Ethan agreed, his gaze lingering on her face a moment longer than necessary before returning to the ledger before him. These quiet evenings had become Violet's favorite part of her days at the ranch. There was something intimate about sharing the work, about the occasional brush of their hands as they passed papers back and forth, about the comfortable silences that fell between them. She found herself noticing more and more things about Ethan, the way he absently ran a hand through his hair when concentrating. The deep timbre of his laugh on the rare occasions something amused him, the gentleness in his eyes when he looked at Emma. These observations stirred feelings in her that she had thought long buried after Thomas's death, a warmth, an anticipation, a heightened awareness of his presence. The harvest social was held the weekend before Thanksgiving in the town hall of Sweetwater. The entire community turned out in their finest clothes for an evening of food, music, and dancing to celebrate the end of the harvest season. Violet spent the afternoon preparing, bathing carefully and styling her hair in a more elaborate arrangement than her usual practical bun. She put on the green dress Ethan had given her, now altered slightly to better fit her figure, which had filled out somewhat during her months of regular meals at the ranch. When she emerged from her room with Emma dressed in a new white gown trimmed with lace, she found Ethan waiting in the main room. He had shaved closely and wore a clean black suit that emphasized the breadth of his shoulders and the leanness of his frame. For a moment, they simply looked at each other. "You look beautiful," Ethan said finally, his voice slightly rough. Violet felt warmth rise to her cheeks. "Thank you. You're very handsome yourself." The ride to town was filled with an electric kind of tension, not uncomfortable, but charged with unspoken possibilities. Emma sat contentedly on Violet's lap, bundled against the November chill, occasionally reaching toward Ethan with a smile that revealed her first tiny teeth. The town hall was transformed for the occasion, decorated with autumn leaves, corn husks, and pumpkins. Lanterns cast a warm glow over the proceedings, and a small group of musicians played lively tunes in one corner. Tables groaned under the weight of pies, cakes, and other delicacies brought by the townspeople. Their entrance caused a momentary lull in conversation, heads turning to observe them. Violet held her head high, determined not to show any discomfort under the scrutiny. Ethan's hand came to rest lightly at the small of her back, a gesture of support that sent a subtle warmth through her. Mrs. Henderson bustled over immediately, cooing over Emma and complimenting Violet's dress. Other women from the church circle followed, and soon Violet found herself part of a group discussing recipes and the coming winter, almost as if she had always been part of the community. Across the room, Ethan was drawn into conversation with several ranchers, though Violet noticed he kept glancing in her direction, as if checking that she was comfortable. The atmosphere shifted subtly when the Montgomerys arrived. James Montgomery was a tall, imperious man with silver at his temples and cold eyes that assessed everyone, as if calculating their worth. His wife Harriet, resplendent in a burgundy silk gown that must have come from Denver or even back east, surveyed the gathering with the air of a queen among commoners. Her gaze fell on Violet, and a tight smile curved her lips as she whispered something to her husband. He glanced over, his expression calculating. "Don't let them intimidate you," Mrs. Henderson whispered, noticing Violet's discomfort. "They think their money makes them better than the rest of us." "Mrs. Nelson," Harriet Montgomery's voice rang out as she approached, cutting through the chatter. "How nice to see you participating in our little community gathering. And with the baby, too. How domestic." Violet straightened, meeting the woman's gaze directly. "Good evening, Mrs. Montgomery. Yes, Emma is enjoying her first social outing. She's very fond of music." "I imagine it must be quite a change for you," Mrs. Montgomery continued, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "From being sold at auction to attending social events, quite a rise in circumstances." Several women nearby gasped softly at the deliberate cruelty of the remark. Violet felt her cheeks burn, but before she could respond, another voice joined the conversation. "A fortunate circumstance for the ranch, Mrs. Montgomery," Ethan said smoothly, appearing at Violet's side. "Mrs. Nelson's management has improved our operations considerably. But then, not everyone appreciates the value of education and capability in a household." Mrs. Montgomery's smile tightened. "How progressive of you, Ethan. Caroline always said you had unconventional ideas." "Speaking of Caroline," Ethan replied, his voice pleasant but with an edge, "I heard she's expecting her second child. Please convey my congratulations when next you write to her in Denver." It was a deliberate reminder that his former fiancée had married and moved on, and a subtle rejection of any lingering claim the Montgomerys might feel they had on him. Harriet's eyes narrowed fractionally. "How thoughtful. I'm sure she'll be pleased to hear you're doing well with your domestic arrangements." With a final assessing glance at Violet, she moved away to join her husband. "I'm sorry about that," Ethan said quietly once she was gone. "Harriet always did enjoy asserting her social position at others' expense." "It's all right," Violet assured him, though her heart still raced from the encounter. "I've faced worse than a society woman's barbs." The musicians struck up a lively reel, and couples began moving to the center of the room for dancing. "Would you honor me with a dance, Violet?" Ethan asked suddenly, his blue eyes warm as they met hers. Violet glanced at Emma in her arms. "I should find someone to hold her. I'll take her," Mrs. Henderson volunteered immediately, already reaching for the baby. "Go on, enjoy yourselves. Emma and I will be just fine." With Emma safely handed over, Violet allowed Ethan to lead her to the dance floor. His hand was warm and strong around hers, and when he placed his other hand at her waist, she felt a flutter of nervousness mixed with anticipation. "I should warn you, I haven't danced in quite some time," she admitted, the corner of Ethan's mouth lifted in a half-smile. "Neither have I. We'll remember together." And then they were moving, finding their rhythm with the music and with each other. Ethan led confidently, guiding her through the steps with a natural grace that belied his usual reserved manner. Violet felt herself relax into the dance, enjoying the sensation of being held, of moving in harmony with someone else. As the evening progressed, they danced several more times, returning to check on Emma between sets. The baby was being thoroughly spoiled by the attention of the church ladies, passed from one admiring woman to another, clearly enjoying the stimulation of the music and lights. It was during a quieter moment, as they stood to the side watching the dancing, that Violet noticed James Montgomery approaching them, his expression determinedly pleasant. "Callahan," he greeted, extending his hand. "Good to see you participating in community events. Mrs. Nelson." He nodded to Violet with perfunctory politeness. "Montgomery," Ethan replied, shaking the offered hand briefly. "Enjoying the festivities. Indeed. Always good to see the town prospering." Montgomery's gaze sharpened. "Speaking of prosperity, I wanted to discuss that note coming due." "Perhaps we could step outside for a moment." Ethan's expression remained neutral. "There's nothing to discuss. The payment will be made on schedule as agreed." Montgomery smiled thinly. "Circumstances change, Callahan. I understand you've taken on additional responsibilities." His gaze flicked to Violet. "I'm prepared to offer very reasonable terms on refinancing. Or, as I've mentioned before, I'd be happy to purchase those water rights outright. It would solve your immediate concerns and provide a cushion for the future." "My financial situation is sound," Ethan replied, his tone cooling. "And the water rights aren't for sale at any price." A flash of irritation crossed Montgomery's face. "Be reasonable, Callahan. That creek is vital to my southern properties. It makes sense for one owner to control the entire water source." "Perhaps," Ethan agreed mildly, "but that owner is me, and I intend it to stay that way." Montgomery's pleasant facade slipped slightly. "Consider carefully, Callahan. Banking is a business of relationships. Those who work cooperatively with us find their needs met generously, those who don't." He left the implication hanging. "Is that a threat, Montgomery?" Ethan asked, his voice dangerously soft. "A business observation," Montgomery replied smoothly. "Nothing more." He nodded to Violet. "Mrs. Nelson, enjoy the remainder of the evening." With that, he returned to his wife's side across the room. "What was that about?" Violet asked, concerned by the tension she'd witnessed. Ethan's jaw was tight. "Montgomery wants my water rights, and he's not used to being denied what he wants. The creek that runs through my property is the main water source for the entire valley. My father secured the rights years ago, before the area was fully settled. And now Montgomery wants control of it. He owns most of the land south of the ranch," Ethan explained. "Without guaranteed access to the creek, that land is far less valuable. He's been trying to pressure me to sell since my parents died." "The note he mentioned, is it significant?" Ethan hesitated. "It's the last payment on a loan my father took to expand the herd 4 years ago. A substantial amount, but manageable. I have the funds set aside." Violet studied his face, sensing there was more he wasn't saying. "Ethan, if there's a problem, there's no problem," he assured her. "Montgomery is just using any leverage he can find. Don't worry about it." But as they collected Emma and prepared to return to the ranch, Violet couldn't shake the feeling that Ethan wasn't telling her everything about his dealings with James Montgomery. The week after the harvest social brought the first real snow of the season, a heavy, wet blanket that transformed the landscape overnight. Violet woke to find the world outside her window pristine white, the bare branches of the cottonwood trees outlined in crystalline perfection. Emma, now nearly 8 months old, was fascinated by the transformation. Violet bundled her warmly and took her onto the porch, laughing at the baby's wide-eyed wonder as she reached for the falling snowflakes. Ethan emerged from the barn, his breath clouding in the cold air as he trudged through the ankle-deep snow. He smiled at the sight of them. "First snow," he called. "Earlier than usual. We'll need to bring the remaining cattle down from the high pasture today. Will you need help?" Violet asked, bouncing Emma gently as she began to fuss in the cold. "Daniel and I can manage," Ethan assured her, climbing the porch steps. He reached for Emma, who went to him willingly, her tiny mittened hands patting his beard-roughened cheeks. "Hello, little one. What do you think of the snow, hum?" The easy affection between Ethan and Emma never failed to warm Violet's heart. Over the past months, Emma had grown increasingly attached to him, lighting up whenever he entered a room, reaching for him when he was near. For his part, Ethan seemed equally enchanted with the baby, often taking time from his work to play with her or rock her to sleep when Violet was busy with household tasks. It created a sense of family that both comforted and unsettled Violet. This wasn't her home, not truly. Ethan wasn't her husband, nor Emma's father. Yet increasingly, it felt like they were building something together that transcended their formal arrangement. That evening, after a long day of bringing the herd closer to the ranch buildings and securing the property against the worsening weather, they sat before the fire while Emma played on a quilt at their feet, happily gumming a wooden rattle Ethan had carved for her. "Winter came on fast this year," Ethan observed, stretching his legs toward the warmth. "We'll need to be careful with the feed stores if it lasts long." "I've been thinking," Violet said hesitantly, "about the situation with Mr. Montgomery." Ethan's relaxed posture stiffened slightly. "What about it? At the social, you mentioned the water rights being important to your father. I wondered why he secured them in the first place if your family doesn't own the southern land." Ethan was quiet for a moment, watching the flames. "My father was forward-thinking," he said finally. "He knew that whoever controlled the water in this valley would ultimately control its future. The rights weren't just about our ranch, but about ensuring no one could monopolize the resource." He leaned forward, his face earnest in the firelight. "Montgomery wants those rights because he intends to divert the creek to benefit only his properties. If that happens, a dozen smaller ranches downstream would suffer. My father made agreements with those families informal, but binding in our community to ensure fair water access for everyone. And Montgomery would break those agreements?" "Without hesitation," Ethan confirmed. "He sees land and water as commodities to be exploited for maximum profit, not resources to be shared." Violet nodded slowly, understanding better now why Ethan remained so firm against Montgomery's offers. "Thank you for explaining. I was concerned after seeing how intense the conversation was at the social." "Montgomery can be persistent," Ethan acknowledged, "but the note will be paid and that particular lever of influence will be gone." He smiled reassuringly. "Enough about banking and water rights. Tell me more about this Christmas pageant Mrs. Henderson mentioned. She seemed quite determined that you should be involved." The change of subject was deliberate, but Violet allowed it, launching into an amusing recounting of Mrs. Henderson's elaborate plans for the town's Christmas celebration. As December progressed, the ranch settled into its winter routine. With the cattle moved to sheltered pastures near the main buildings, the daily work shifted to maintenance tasks, repairing equipment, mending fences when weather permitted, and ensuring a steady supply of firewood to keep the house warm. Violet's days were filled with household management, caring for Emma, and increasingly, helping Ethan with the ranch accounts. The approaching Christmas season brought additional tasks: baking special treats, sewing simple gifts for Ethan and Daniel, and preparing for the town's celebration. One evening, as a blizzard howled outside, Violet sat by the fire working on a scarf she was knitting for Ethan as a Christmas gift. Emma had gone to sleep early, exhausted from an afternoon of crawling energetically around the kitchen while Violet baked bread. Ethan entered, stamping snow from his boots at the door. His face was red from the cold, his hair damp with melted snow. "It's brutal out there," he said, removing his heavy coat and hanging it by the fire to dry. "I've never seen it snow so hard so early in the season." "There's coffee keeping warm on the stove," Violet offered, "and stew if you're hungry." "Coffee first," Ethan decided, moving to the kitchen. He returned moments later with a steaming mug, settling into the chair opposite Violet. "What are you working on?" Violet quickly tucked the half-finished scarf into her sewing basket. "Nothing important, just keeping my hands busy." Ethan smiled, seeing through her attempt at secrecy but not pressing the matter. "I need to ride into town tomorrow if the storm breaks," he said instead. "The bank payment is due by the end of the week." Violet looked up, concerned. "In this weather, the roads will be treacherous." "It can't be helped," Ethan replied. "I've put it off as long as possible, hoping for a break in the weather, but the deadline won't wait." "Could Daniel go instead?" Violet suggested. "Or could you send the payment with the mail carrier?" Ethan shook his head. "I need to handle it personally. There are some details to discuss with Montgomery." He sipped his coffee, his expression guarded. "I won't be gone long, a day at most if the weather allows." Something in his tone made Violet uneasy. "Ethan, is everything all right with the payment? You've seemed preoccupied lately." For a moment she thought he might evade the question again, but then his shoulders sagged slightly. "There's been a complication," he admitted. "Cattle prices dropped unexpectedly this fall. The money I set aside for the payment, I had to use some of it to secure enough feed for the winter after those early storms damaged the hay crop." Violet's concern deepened. "How short are you?" "About $200, Ethan said, rubbing a hand over his face. "Not an impossible sum, but significant. I'm going to ask Montgomery for a short extension just until spring when I can sell some of the yearlings." "Will he agree for a price?" Ethan said grimly. "Additional interest, certainly, and he'll use it as another opportunity to press for the water rights." Violet set aside her sewing entirely, thinking quickly. "I have money," she said suddenly. Ethan looked up, startled. "What, my wages?" Violet explained. "You've been paying me regularly since October, and I've had no reason to spend the money. It's not $200, but it's almost $150. "Violet, no," Ethan said firmly. "I won't take your savings. That money is for you and Emma's future." "It's an investment in our present," Violet countered. "If Montgomery gains leverage over the ranch, my position here becomes less secure as well." "Still, I can't—" "You can and you will," Violet interrupted, her tone brooking no argument. "Consider it a loan if your pride requires it. You can repay me in the spring just as you would Montgomery, but without his interest rates or conditions." Ethan stared at her, something like wonder in his eyes. "You do that? After everything you've been through?" "You took a chance on me when I had nothing," Violet said softly. "You've given Emma and me a home, safety, dignity. This is a small thing in comparison." Ethan set his coffee aside and leaned forward, taking Violet's hands in his. "It's not a small thing, Violet. It's everything." His thumbs traced gentle circles on her palms, sending warmth spreading up her arms. "I don't know how to thank you." "There's no need," Violet replied, her voice slightly unsteady at his touch. "We help each other, isn't that what friends do?" "Friends," Ethan repeated, his gaze holding hers. "Is that what we are, Violet?" The question hung between them, laden with unspoken possibilities. Violet's heart raced as she recognized the moment for what it was, a threshold they could cross or retreat from, changing everything that lay ahead. "I think," she said carefully, "we might be something more than friends if you wanted that." Ethan's hands tightened gently around hers. "I've wanted that almost since the day you arrived," he admitted, his voice low. "But I didn't want you to feel obligated or dependent. I wanted you to choose freely if you chose me at all." "I'm choosing now," Violet whispered, slowly, Giving her every chance to pull away, Ethan leaned forward. His lips met hers in a kiss that began gently but quickly deepened as Violet responded, her hands sliding up to his shoulders. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Ethan rested his forehead against hers. "I've been falling in love with you, Violet Nelson," he confessed. "With your strength, your kindness, your determination. With the way you care for Emma, the way you've made this house a home again. I think I've loved you since I saw you standing on that auction block, holding your baby and still keeping your dignity intact." Tears pricked at Violet's eyes. "I never expected to feel this way again," she said. "After Thomas died, I thought that part of my life was over. But you made me believe in possibilities again." Ethan cupped her cheek, his thumb wiping away a tear that had escaped. "What are you saying, Violet?" "I'm saying I love you too," she replied simply. "I love the man who stepped forward when no one else would. Who said they belonged to me not to own us, but to protect us." Ethan kissed her again, more passionately this time, pulling her onto his lap as the blizzard raged outside and the fire crackled in the hearth. In that moment, surrounded by warmth and safety, Violet knew she had truly found her home. The storm broke the next morning, leaving a transformed landscape of pristine white drifts and crystal-clear blue skies. Ethan and Violet rode into town together, Emma bundled warmly between them to make the bank payment. With Violet's savings added to Ethan's funds, they had enough to meet the obligation in full. James Montgomery's surprise was poorly concealed when Ethan presented the complete payment, effectively removing any leverage the banker had hoped to gain. "Well," Montgomery said, recovering quickly, "it's always satisfying when a customer meets their obligations promptly. Though I must admit, I had a very reasonable refinancing offer prepared." "That won't be necessary," Ethan replied evenly, his hand resting lightly on Violet's back in a gesture that didn't go unnoticed by the banker. "The loan is now paid in full. I'd like the deed to be released from escrow, please." As they left the bank, the deed to the water rights secured safely in Ethan's pocket, Violet felt a weight lift from both their shoulders. "That's one battle won," Ethan said as he helped her into the wagon. "Montgomery won't give up entirely, but he's lost his strongest point of pressure." "What will he try next?" Violet asked, settling Emma on her lap. Ethan shrugged, climbing up beside them. "Hard to say, but whatever it is, we'll face it together." The town was decorated for Christmas, wreaths and garlands adorning the storefronts, the church spire topped with a star that glinted in the winter sunlight. They stopped at the general store, where Ethan insisted on buying several packages that he refused to let Violet see, hiding them under a blanket in the wagon. "Christmas surprises," he explained with a wink that made her heart flutter. Their return to the ranch was jubilant, both buoyed by the resolution of the financial pressure and the new understanding between them. That evening, after Emma was asleep, they sat before the fire, planning for Christmas and, more tentatively, for their future. "I want to do this properly," Ethan said, his arm around Violet as she leaned against his shoulder. "Court you the way you deserve." Violet smiled up at him. "Haven't we been courting these past months without realizing it? The quiet evenings, the conversations by the fire, the way you've cared for Emma as if she were your own." "Perhaps we have," Ethan acknowledged, pressing a kiss to her temple. "But now I want everyone to know my intentions. I want to take you to church as more than my housekeeper. I want to walk with you in town, take you to the spring social as my intended." "Your intended," Violet repeated, a teasing note in her voice. "Is that a proposal, Ethan Callahan?" His expression turned serious. "Not yet. When I propose, you'll know it. I want to do right by you, Violet. Give you time to be certain, make sure Emma is settled, but I do want to marry you when you're ready." Violet's heart swelled with emotion. "I think I'd like that very much," she said softly. Christmas arrived with fresh snow and bright sunshine. The ranch house was festive with pine boughs and red ribbons, the scent of violets baking filling the air. Daniel joined them for Christmas dinner, bringing a handmade rocking horse for Emma that delighted the baby. Ethan's gifts for Violet included a beautiful leather-bound journal, a new winter coat, and a delicate silver locket containing tiny portraits of both Emma and Ethan himself. Violet presented him with the finished scarf and a new ledger book she had painstakingly prepared with all the ranch accounts organized in her neat handwriting. But the most meaningful gift came after Daniel had departed, and Emma was sleeping soundly in her cradle. Ethan led Violet to the fireplace and handed her a small envelope. "One more gift," he said, watching her face intently. "Perhaps the most important one." Inside, Violet found a legal document. As she read it, her hand flew to her mouth in shock. "Ethan, this is the contract from the auction," he confirmed. "Marked paid in full and nullified." Tears filled Violet's eyes as she stared at the document. "But I still have 7 months of service." "I don't want your service, Violet," Ethan said gently, taking her hands in his. "I never did. I want your partnership, your companionship, your love freely given, not bound by a contract. Whatever happens between us from this point forward, I want you to know you're not obligated to stay. You're here because you choose to be." Violet threw her arms around his neck, the tears flowing freely now. "I do choose to be here," she whispered fiercely. "With you, always." Ethan held her tightly, his own eyes suspiciously bright. "Always," he echoed. The winter passed in a haze of happiness for Violet and Ethan. Their love deepened with each passing day as they settled into a new relationship dynamic, no longer employer and employee, but true partners. Ethan took Violet into town regularly, proudly walking with her on his arm, making his intentions clear to the community. Some, like Mrs. Montgomery, sniffed disapprovingly at the development, but most of the townspeople embraced the romance. Mrs. Henderson declared it the most romantic thing since statehood, while the Reverend simply nodded approvingly when Ethan and Violet began sitting closer together in church. Emma thrived under the love of both Violet and Ethan, taking her first steps in February, toddling unsteadily from her mother's arms into Ethan's waiting hands. Her first clear word, to Violet's mixed amusement and jealousy, was Eton, her attempt at Ethan's name. As March brought the first hints of spring, melting snow revealing patches of green beneath, Ethan became increasingly restless and secretive, disappearing for hours with Daniel on mysterious errands, having hushed conversations that stopped when Violet entered a room. "What are you plotting?" she finally asked one evening as Ethan returned from yet another unexplained absence. "You'll find out soon enough," he replied with a mischievous smile that reminded her of Emma when the toddler was hiding a cookie. A week later, on a mild Saturday morning, Ethan announced they were going for a ride. "Just the 3 of us," he said, helping Violet into the wagon while Emma bounced excitedly on her hip. "I have something to show you." He drove north, following the creek that formed the lifeblood of the ranch, until they reached a gentle rise overlooking a meadow. The spot commanded a spectacular view of the ranch buildings below, the distant mountains, and the creek winding its silver path through the greening land. "It's beautiful," Violet said, drinking in the vista as Ethan helped her from the wagon. Emma immediately demanded to be set down, eager to explore the wildflowers already beginning to dot the meadow. "This was my mother's favorite place on the ranch," Ethan explained, watching as Emma toddled after a butterfly. "She said it was where you could best feel the heart of the land." He took Violet's hand, leading her to a spot where the ground had been recently disturbed. To her surprise, a foundation of fresh-cut stones had been laid in a perfect rectangle. "Ethan, what is this?" "This," he said, a note of pride in his voice, "is where our house will stand." Violet's eyes widened. "Our house?" "I've been working with Daniel and some men from town," Ethan explained. "The materials are ordered and construction begins next month. It will be ready by late summer." He gestured to the foundation. "3 bedrooms, one for us, one for Emma, and one." He hesitated, a flush rising to his cheeks, for whatever additions might come to our family in the future. Understanding dawned on Violet. "Ethan Callahan, are you finally proposing to me?" In answer, Ethan reached into his pocket and dropped to one knee, holding out a ring. The simple gold band held a modest diamond that caught the spring sunlight, sending rainbows dancing across Violet's skirt. "Violet Nelson," Ethan said, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. "From the moment I saw you standing on that auction block, holding your baby and facing an uncertain future with courage, I knew you were extraordinary. These months together have only confirmed what my heart sensed then, that you are the woman I want to share my life with, to build a home with, to raise children with." He took a deep breath. "I love you, Violet. I love Emma as if she were my own daughter. Will you marry me, make this ranch your true home, and let me be a father to Emma and any children we might be blessed with in the future?" Tears of joy spilled down Violet's cheeks. "Yes," she whispered, then louder, "Yes. With all my heart, yes." Ethan slipped the ring onto her finger, then stood and pulled her into his arms, kissing her with all the love and promise of their future together. They were so absorbed in each other that they almost missed Emma's excited babbling as she toddled back to them, clutching a handful of wildflowers. Laughing, Ethan swept the little girl into his arms, holding her between them. "What do you think, Emma? Should I marry your mama and be your papa?" "Papa," Emma exclaimed, reaching for Ethan's face with her flower-filled hands, leaving smudges of pollen on his cheeks. "Papa." Violet's heart overflowed with joy. "I think that's a yes from both of us." They were married in the Sweetwater Church on a perfect May morning, with Emma as their flower girl, helped down the aisle by a beaming Mrs. Henderson. Daniel stood as Ethan's best man, while Martha from the church served as Violet's matron of honor. The entire town turned out for the celebration. Even the Montgomerys made an appearance, though Harriet's congratulations were noticeably strained. For the most part, however, the community embraced the union wholeheartedly, seeing in it a story of redemption and hope that resonated with the frontier spirit. From auction block to altar, Mrs. Henderson was overheard saying to the Reverend's wife, "If that's not God's providence at work, I don't know what is." By August, their new house on the hill was completed, a spacious, sun-filled home with large windows that captured the spectacular views in all directions. They moved in just as the summer harvest was ending, making the transition seamlessly as if they had always been meant to live there together. The original ranch house was converted to accommodate Daniel and a second ranch hand they'd hired as the cattle operation expanded, ensuring someone was always near the main buildings and barn. With Ethan's encouragement, Violet began teaching Emma and the children of neighboring ranchers 3 mornings a week, fulfilling her original dream of being a teacher while still managing the household and helping with the ranch accounts. Life settled into a rhythm of hard work and deep contentment. Ethan's natural reserve gave way to a more demonstrative nature as he grew into his roles as husband and father. Emma, now talking in full sentences, followed him everywhere when he was home, helping with his chores and demanding stories at night. One evening in early October, Almost exactly a year after their first kiss by the fireplace, Violet and Ethan sat on the porch of their new home, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains in shades of gold and purple. Emma had been put to bed after an exhausting day of helping with the apple harvest from the small orchard near the house. "You ever think about it?" Ethan asked suddenly. "How different things might have been if I hadn't been at that auction?" Violet leaned against his shoulder, her hand resting on her abdomen where their second child, confirmed by Dr. Henderson just the week before, was growing. "Sometimes," she admitted. "But then I think it couldn't have been any other way. We were meant to find each other." Ethan's arm tightened around her shoulders. "I'd like to think so. That even if I hadn't been there that day, somehow we would have found our way to each other." "Perhaps," Violet agreed, "but I'm grateful it happened as it did. Even the hardest parts led us here to this life we've built." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. "When should we tell Emma about the baby?" Ethan asked eventually, his hand covering Violet's where it rested on her still flat stomach. "Soon," Violet decided. "She's young, but she'll understand enough to be excited, though we should prepare for endless questions." Ethan chuckled. "She's her mother's daughter, curious about everything and twice as stubborn." "And her father's," Violet countered with a smile. "I've never seen such determination to finish a task as when she's helping you with the horses." The easy way Ethan had stepped into the role of Emma's father had been one of the greatest joys of their marriage. From the beginning, he had treated her as his own child, and Emma had accepted him with the uncomplicated love of a child who feels secure and cherished. While Violet kept a small portrait of Thomas in Emma's room, ensuring her daughter would know of her birth father, it was Ethan she called Papa. Ethan whose approval she sought. Ethan who checked under her bed for monsters and taught her to ride her own pony. "I've been thinking," Ethan said after another comfortable silence, "about expanding the schoolroom. With the Henderson twins and the new Miller family moving in down the valley, you'll have at least 8 students by spring. You need more space." Violet nodded thoughtfully. "We could use the old storage building by the creek. With some windows added and proper flooring, it would make a fine schoolhouse." "My thoughts exactly," Ethan agreed. "I'll talk to Daniel about starting the renovations before winter sets in." Such conversations had become the foundation of their marriage, practical decisions made together, each respecting the other's expertise and insight. The partnership Ethan had spoken of had become a reality, with each of them contributing their strengths to build a life that was far richer than either could have achieved alone. As darkness fell fully, bringing with it the crisp chill of an autumn night, Ethan stood and offered Violet his hand. "Come on, Mrs. Callahan. Time to get you and our little one inside where it's warm." Violet allowed him to help her up, then wrapped her arms around his waist, looking up at the man who had changed her life with 6 simple words spoken on an auction block. "They belong to me." "I love you, Ethan Callahan," she said softly. "Every day I love you more." Ethan's kiss was tender, filled with the quiet certainty of a love that had been tested and proven true. "And I love you, Violet Callahan. You and Emma and this little one on the way, you're my world." Hand in hand, they walked into their home, leaving behind the darkness and cold of the night, moving toward the light and warmth that they had created together, a beacon of hope and love in the wild Wyoming wilderness. 5 years later, the Callahan Ranch had prospered beyond anyone's expectations. The main house on the hill had been expanded to accommodate their growing family, Emma, now 8, and showing the same intelligence and determination as her mother, Jacob, a sturdy 4-year-old with his father's blue eyes and easy smile, and Grace, a precocious 2-year-old who had everyone wrapped around her tiny finger. Violet's school had grown into a proper community institution, with 15 students attending regularly in a purpose-built schoolhouse near the main ranch buildings. With Ethan's encouragement, she had expanded the curriculum beyond basic reading and arithmetic to include literature, natural sciences, and even rudimentary Latin for the older students. The ranch itself had doubled in size when the neighboring property came up for sale after its elderly owner passed away. The combined operation now employed 6 ranch hands year-round, with additional help during the busy seasons. James Montgomery had finally given up his pursuit of the water rights after Ethan organized the valley's ranchers into a formal water cooperative, ensuring fair access for all while legally protecting against any single entity gaining control. The bankers' influence in Sweetwater had waned as the town grew and diversified, with new businesses and families bringing fresh perspectives and diminishing the stranglehold the Montgomerys had once held on local affairs. On a warm June afternoon, the Callahan family gathered on the porch to watch a stagecoach approaching from town, an eagerly anticipated arrival carrying Ethan's sister Rebecca, her husband, and their 3 children from California for a summer visit. Emma, tall for her age and with her mother's auburn hair flowing down her back, bounced with excitement. "Are they really going to stay for a whole month, Papa?" "A whole month," Ethan confirmed, adjusting Grace on his hip as the toddler pointed excitedly at the approaching coach. "You'll have plenty of time to get to know your cousins." Violet smiled at her husband, still handsome as ever though his face now bore the weathered lines of a man who worked outdoors in all seasons. The years had been good to them both, bringing growth, challenges overcome together, and a deepening of the love that had begun in such unlikely circumstances. As the stagecoach drew closer, Ethan's free arm slid around Violet's waist, drawing her against his side. "Happy?" he asked softly, a ritual question between them. "Completely," she replied, leaning into his embrace. "And you?" His kiss was his answer, tender and full of the quiet passion that still burned between them. "More than I ever thought possible." They moved forward together to greet their visitors, surrounded by the family they had built, on the land they had nurtured, under the vast Wyoming sky that had witnessed their journey from strangers bound by desperation to partners united by love. And as Violet watched Ethan swing their youngest daughter high in the air, her laughter ringing across the ranch yard, she thought back to that desperate day at the auction block. She had stood there with nothing but her baby and her pride, facing a future that seemed hopelessly bleak. Then a stranger had stepped forward, a man with kind eyes and a quiet voice who had changed everything with a simple declaration. "They belong to me, not as possessions to be owned, but as precious souls to be cherished, not as burdens to be borne, but as gifts to be treasured." In the end, they had all found where they truly belonged with each other,